here in the United States at Harvard University and the University of Chicago, in addition to Union Theological Seminary. He died in 1965, and he was well known as a Christian existentialist. Among other concepts he has promoted was that the resurrection that's celebrated by Christians today was a spiritual rather than a religious and physical event. Now, provide those 10 quotes. The first one: all things and all people, so to speak, call on us with small or loud voices. They want us to listen. They want us to understand their intrinsic claims, their justice of being. But we can give it to them only through the love that listens. The second quote: the name of this infinite and inexhaustible depth and ground of all being is God. Third quote: God does not exist. God is being itself, beyond essence and beyond existence. Therefore, to argue that God exists is to deny God. Fourth, doubt is not the opposite of faith. It is one element of faith. Fifth, in those who rest on their unshakable faith, Pharisaism and fanaticism are the unmistakable symptoms of doubt which has been repressed. Doubt is not overcome by repression, but by courage. Courage does not deny that there is a doubt, but it takes the doubt into itself as an expression of its own finitude and affirms the content of an ultimate concern. Courage does not need the safety of an unquestionable conviction. It includes the risk without which no creative life is possible. Sixth quote: fear is the absence of faith. Seventh, sometimes I think it is my mission to bring faith to the faithless and doubt to the faithful. 8, because the first duty of love is to listen. 9, you are accepted. You are accepted by that which is greater than you, and the name of which you do not know. Do not ask for the name now. Perhaps you will find it later. Do not try to do anything now. Perhaps later you will have to do much. Do not seek for anything. Do not perform anything. Do not intend anything. Simply accept the fact that you are accepted. And finally, I hope for the day when everyone can speak again of God without embarrassment. And now I'll welcome McKinley back to the pulpit to provide today's homily.
Thank you, Steve. Happy Easter. For those of us who may not be familiar with Easter, this can sometimes happen in UU congregations, here's a quick recap. Easter is the story that is full of myth and miracle, right? It's the story of Jesus of Nazareth, a rabbi, an itinerant, homeless Palestinian rabbi who's brown-skinned, funded by women, ran around with working-class people, trying to help make the world a better place, and preaching this message of a love that accepts all, a love that is all-encompassing. And because of this message, he is labeled an enemy of the Roman Empire that is occupying where he lives in the land of Judea, what we now call the state of Israel and the state of Palestine. And Jesus is crucified, executed by the Roman government for being a threat to the empire. And after 3 days, his disciples, his family, his chosen family, witness what they call resurrection. Resurrection. This is a story full of myth and miracle, and for many UUs, we think this cannot possibly have anything to teach us, modern, enlightened people that may not believe in some of these stories. And I hear that, and I offer that while that may be true, there may be no parallel between a time and a place where a religious minority living in a homeland recently overtaken by an occupying force bent on persecuting its enemies and ruling by fear, disappearing anyone who disagrees and seeking to enrich themselves at the expense of the common people, while using religious language and symbols to justify their violence and greed, probably doesn't make any sense for us, right? Because this is important to know about the Easter story, that it's taking place underneath the Roman occupation of Jerusalem and the surrounding area. And in the Roman Empire, you had to confess and profess that the king, the emperor, the Caesar, was the son of God, was the son of the god Apollo. And the common refrain in Rome was that Caesar is Lord. And if anything less than that, if you did not believe in that, if you worked against that, persecution at the very least, and at the most, you were crucified. Crucifixion is a word that many of us may know. It did not exist until the Romans invented it. They invented it as a way to execute people, but not just to kill someone. They invented crucifixion to teach everyone a lesson, to make a public statement about what it meant to defy the Roman Empire. It was like an executive order, right? It was designed to scare people into submission. It was designed to crush any dissent, any community building, any expressions of joy or solidarity. It was designed to keep the peace, the Roman peace, a peace that was built on fear of the sword, fear of persecution. It was strongman tactics way before it was popular. And in this time of occupation and in this time of crucifixion, this ragtag bunch of yokels, people of different skin tones from different places who spoke different languages, from different levels of social strata, got together to proclaim amongst themselves resurrection. Resurrection happens. There are lots of different words of understanding the resurrection, lots of different ways of understanding the resurrection. Paul Tillich is one of my favorite theologians. He has this way of understanding resurrection. But what's important to know about the resurrection is that it happens in this political context, in this empire context, in this context of fear and oppression. And in spite of all of that, in spite of the fear of crucifixion, in spite of the example of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, this group of people gets together to proclaim resurrection. In a time when it is dangerous to speak up, the early church, as we call them, is full of stories of people who were witnesses to resurrection. Oftentimes, the witnessing of the resurrection led to death, led to persecution, led to more crucifixions. In a time when it was dangerous to speak up, these people lived their faith out loud. They spoke their values. They risked the crucifixion to be people of faith. Those who are not killed, who are not persecuted, are forced to go underground, to meet in secret, to meet in the dead of night and outside of the city walls, to meet in basements, to form the first congregations. And when they get together, the early church, they don't get together and they don't sit in pews. They might have sung songs. I'm sure they had prayers. But the central thing that they did when they got together was to eat together, to share conversation with one another. They called these agape meals, the Greek word for love. They called them love feasts. And before they would meet on a certain day of the week, in secret, they would go around their neighborhoods and make sure that everyone was invited who had heard the story, who wanted to be a witness to resurrection. They made sure that everyone had money to pay their rent. They made sure that they had a place to sleep. They made sure that they knew that they were loved and accepted and invited to hear this message of a love that accepts all, a love that is so dangerous to the Roman Empire, they tried to kill it on a cross. But they meet at these love feasts to share a meal and to tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth and to proclaim resurrection happens. We're going to talk about two Pauls very briefly. The first Paul we've heard of is Paul Tillich, this German theologian who was forced to leave his home by the Nazis, came to America, was known as the theologian's theologian, was kind of like a rock star theologian back in the 1950s and 60s, even though he spoke with a heavy German accent and used big words that were hard to understand. A famous refrain, someone listened to one of his sermons, and then they were dialoguing afterwards, and a guy reached over and said to his partner, "What did you think of Tillich's sermon?" He said, "I didn't understand it, but woo, it was something." He spoke about the resurrection, saying, could it be a historical event? Can we prove that it happened? No. That was not important. What was important was that the witnesses to the resurrection, the early church people who gathered together in these love feasts, that they proclaimed resurrection happens. And the resurrection was happening in their hearts, in their spirits, as they formed these communities of love and acceptance in defiance of the Roman Empire. That their faith was a faith of courage. And Paul Tillich is big on courage. Their faith was courageous affirmation of themselves and their communities, despite and in spite of the Roman Empire. It's very important that their faith was courageous in spite of this great looming darkness, this great fear. Paul Tillich, who grew up in Germany, spoke to the context of resurrection. The Apostle Paul is our second Paul. He wrote a letter to the Roman church. You may have read it. It's very famous. It's included in the Christian scriptures that many call the New Testament. Paul's letter to the Romans is this beautiful pastoral letter. It's full of lots of complicated theology that we can't get into right now. But there's an interesting line when Paul is speaking to this group of people who have been forced underground, who are meeting with these love feasts to proclaim resurrection. And he says, be subject to the governing authorities. Be subject to the Roman Empire. That's his advice. And you read that and you think, well, that's kind of weird. And there are people who are in power now who for the last 4 years did not believe in that, being subject to the governing authorities, but now love to tell people like me to be subject to the governing authorities because the Apostle Paul said so in a letter to the Romans 2,000 years ago. But here's the interesting thing about this letter. When Paul writes this letter to the Roman church that says be subject to the governing authorities, he also goes on to talk about power and authority and like who you should obey, kind of like Dr. Martin Luther King. Do we obey just laws or unjust laws? And you can't obey an unjust law, right? So it's okay to break that law. It's kind of like that. But his point is basically, if there's a group of people who do not participate in your social covenant, in your faith covenant, who do not hold your same values, right? Who do not speak the same theological language as you, if they are willing to kill anyone, to disappear anyone who dissents, if they are willing to break the foundational laws of your country, they're no longer part of the social contract, right? And you do not have to obey those laws because they are so far out of the bounds that only the love that they try to kill on a cross can save them. That's not something you hear about in these churches that tell you to be subject to the governing authorities. Then he goes on to say what you have to do, the only law you have to obey, is the law that says love one another. And if you keep that law, you are obeying the only authority you need. So when they get together and have these love feasts and say that resurrection happens, they use this Greek word, anastasis. Anastasis. If you know someone named Anastasia, if you know a Greek person named Tass, that's where they get this name, anastasis. It means resurrection. But it doesn't just mean resurrection. It also means literally raising up something, lifting up. It also means lifting someone out of poverty, out of despair, out of depression. It also means restoring what was broken. When the early church got together and had these love feasts, that's what they were doing. They weren't just proclaiming resurrection, they were doing it. It was happening in their hearts, but they were also doing resurrection, making sure that people had enough to eat, making sure that people heard the message that they were loved and accepted. When they sang in these underground churches, meeting in basements under fear of persecution and death, they sang with courage and with joy. It might feel like it can be hard to be joyful here. But joy happens despite and in spite of those authorities that are so far out of the social contract that we need not concern ourselves with every waking moment of what's happening, what's the next horrible thing. Because there's going to be a next horrible thing. But that does not mean that when we gather together for our love feast, that we can't sing with joy, live with joy every morning, finding joy in the small, everyday, normal things. Because to live with joy is to live courageously, to practice our UU faith with courage, the courage that Paul Tillich spoke about, the courage that is in spite of the horrible thing, the courage that says that you are accepted. That was his definition of faith, to live with purpose and with joy and with love in spite of, take your pick. In our context today, I invite us to think about resurrection and to practice resurrection. Because the love that is so big, that accepts, that they tried to kill on a cross, should have died in that first century when they were crucifying people to send a message and ruling with fear and the sword. And it didn't. Because on Easter, we are reminded that resurrection happens. No matter how awful the thing is, no matter how many times they try to proclaim that Caesar is Lord, and that is the only way, resurrection happens. May our faith be one of resurrection. May it live with joy and courage, in spite of and despite the context that we are in. May we have a faith that is based in the courage to be, the courage to do, the courage to speak, the courage to be seen, the courage to be heard, the courage to be lifted up, to be resurrected whenever we come to these love feasts. May we be witnesses to this joy, and may we proclaim that joy to one another when we need it. I am so joyful to be back amongst you, and I am so looking forward to our resurrection. May it be so. Amen. Invite our choir to rise, be resurrected, and come forward and share our special music today.